I want to thank you all for coming to our first in-person Energy Club seminar, like in 2 years. I've actually never been to an in-person Student Energy Club seminar, even though I'm president. So thank you for coming. We will have pizza. Unfortunately, there's no food in this room, so we're gonna have the pizza come maybe like 4:45, and then we'll just afterwards just eat the pizza outside. There should be more than enough. And Dr. Sagues is assistant professor and the principal investigator of the Biocarbon Utilization Sequestration Lab in the Biological Agricultural Engineering Department at NC State University. And he has experience in research, development, and demonstration of innovative bioprocessing technologies at corporations, universities, and national labs. During graduate school, he conducted independent research as a technology to market scholar at the Department of Energy's Advanced Research Projects Agency as the Office of Science Graduate Student Research Fellow at the National Renewable Lab. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Sagues. Super excited to be here. I actually didn't know about the Energy Club up until like 3 months ago. And so I'm on the listserv now. I get all the emails. I think you guys are doing great things. Your faculty advisor, I know his first name is Joe. He just got like promoted to some like federal, what was it? EIA, that's right, administrator, which is really cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I was hoping he would be here.
Oh, yeah. So I think we have a new, I think Jeremiah Johnson.
Oh, okay. Joe's leaving. Yeah, I need to meet him eventually. But anyway, okay, so the title of my talk today is a carbon-negative bioeconomy. And so as Emily mentioned, I lead a lab called the Biocarbon Utilization and Sequestration Lab. A lot of our work, not all of our work, is focused on trying to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So I'm going to give kind of just a high-level overview of the industry, some of the leading technologies, and then at the very end, I'll talk about some of the work that I'm doing in my lab. All right, so I want to start off by defining the problem, some of the motivation behind the research that we do. So we have a problem, and it's climate change. That's sort of the term that everyone's most familiar with, but I like to view it as more of a carbon problem, right? And so every day, the planet receives a lot of solar radiation, right? Energy, that is what makes our planet habitable. Basically, there's this thin layer of warming. That's called the greenhouse effect. That's what induces the warming. But some of the solar radiation is reflected back to space, right? What keeps some of the heat close to the planet are these greenhouse gases, namely CO2 being the most dominant. So about 250 years ago, we discovered fossil fuels. First peat in England, and then we moved on to coal, petroleum, natural gas. We started taking that carbon, which has been in the geological realm for millions of years, and we've been transferring it to the atmospheric realm, right? And so slowly, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has been rising. And of course, as it rises, you get more greenhouse effect, more warming, less solar radiation back to space, to the point where we're at now, which is almost double what the concentration was before we discovered fossil fuels. And so that's a lot of carbon, right? A big pool of carbon just sort of swimming around our atmosphere. We need to stop emitting carbon first and foremost, but it seems like now we actually have to start extracting some of that carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back into the geological reservoir. And so I pulled this article from 2 days ago. This is, there was a big fund that was created of right under $1 billion. The funds are coming from Stripe, Alphabet, which I believe is Google's like parent company now, Meta, Facebook. They all put in a bunch of money, a bunch of the tech companies, because they want to create a market for this industry. And so these $1 billion are going to be used to buy carbon removal credits. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, they put out this figure in 2018, which was showing the emissions trajectories in the next 70 years, 80, 70 years. So we have total CO2 emissions, global emissions per year on the y-axis, and billions of tons of CO2 equivalent per year, which I'll talk about in just a moment, and then time. And so by 2090, we need to be net zero. We want to stay below 2 degrees C warming, which is what most experts believe is like necessary. And so if we don't do anything, we'll follow this track and we'll go way above 2C, approaching 4C, which has a lot of implications for the environment, for public health, food, everything like that. So if we want to stay at this red line, then we're going to get there through a combination of reducing emissions from conventional technologies, which this club is intimately familiar with, I'm sure, right? Nuclear energy, wind, solar, batteries. So the vast majority of emissions cuts should and hopefully will come from these carbon-free technologies. Unfortunately, we have some other greenhouse gases other than CO2 that are emitted in various sectors of our economy, agriculture being one of the biggest. So you have nitrous oxide, methane, and fluorocarbons, and they actually induce a lot of warming. And so one way to counteract them is by extracting CO2 from the atmosphere. And so we have those greenhouse gases, and then we also have fossil CO2, which most experts believe even by the end of this century, will still have some emissions, much less than what we're emitting today. We're emitting about 50 gigatons a year, but people think we'll still be around 10 gigatons at the end of the century, about 1/5 of what we're emitting today. So how are we going to get to net zero with these emissions? We're going to do what's called net negative. That's extracting CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's the main motivation. The other part of the motivation for this area of work is a lot of the CO2 that's emitted today and what's been emitted over the last 100 years is what's called legacy carbon. So about 30% of the CO2 that's emitted stays in the atmosphere for millennia. And so that warming effect is in the pipeline for a long time. So we need ways to bring it out of the atmosphere as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's these other greenhouse gases, and they're typically quantified on a CO2 equivalency, right? So this y-axis is CO2 equivalency. And the way you calculate CO2 equivalency is by using this formula down here. You take the mass of your greenhouse gas and you multiply it by the global warming potential, which is shown here. Right, so the warming potential for 2 tons of methane is equivalent to 50 tons of carbon dioxide. So methane on a mass basis is a very potent greenhouse gas. And these two are really problematic. The fluorocarbons we have under control, they're pretty much illegal now in most countries, but these, we emit a lot of methane and nitrous oxide. We don't really have any good solutions to avoid it. Methane, maybe. Nitrous oxide is really tough. It comes from over-fertilizing agricultural fields. And methane, there's a bunch of different methane sources. So these are some of the more current trajectories IPC has been putting out. And so I think the main takeaway is to sort of draw your attention to these 4 scenarios down here. The LED scenario is a scenario where we do extremely rapid decarbonization, electrification. In that case, there are practically no negative emissions required. Right? We'll be able to stop emitting fossil carbon in the next 8 years globally, all of it. In that case, we'll hit our target. Most people don't think that's really going to happen, and so the longer we wait, the more negative emissions we unfortunately will need. And this scenario here is, of course, extreme. So we're trying to hopefully be somewhere in S1 or S2. LED would be great. It's just really, really hard to do. So there's really 2 main approaches to removing CO2 from the atmosphere. You have natural and engineered processes. That's kind of how they're commonly divided. But the main goal is to bring that CO2 out of the atmosphere into either the lithosphere, biosphere, or hydrosphere in a permanent form. Really quickly, I want to clarify some terms. So CO2 avoidance does not equal CO2 neutrality, which does not equal CO2 removal. These are all different, but they're thrown around a lot. And so avoidance involves technologies that produce lower emissions than a reference system. So these are typically things like nuclear, wind, solar. They're replacing some fossil carbon emitting industry. So you're avoiding the emissions of CO2. You can have carbon neutral technologies where over the life cycle, there's no net emissions. And so theoretically, a biofuel could be carbon neutral. It's oftentimes not, but it could be, right? Because the plants bring in the carbon dioxide and then you use that fixed carbon for energy and release the CO2 back into the environment. And then you have removal, where if you have like a power plant and you're feeding it biomass and you capture the CO2 and sequester it, I'm not particularly a fan of this type of carbon removal, but theoretically, this would be a negative technology. Over the life cycle of the energy, you would be carbon negative. And so some interchangeable terminology you'll hear: carbon dioxide removal, carbon negative systems, negative emissions. These all basically mean the same thing. Carbon sequestration is a bit of a caveat because you could be burning coal in this power plant and then sequestering it, and at best that would be carbon neutral, right? But it would still be called carbon sequestration. It wouldn't be carbon negative. Okay, so just quick definitions. Engineered CDR technologies typically involve industrial operations with exogenous energy supply, so lots of sort of synthesized energy, not passive systems. And then natural is on the other side of that, where you have really passive energy supply, very slow kinetics, and typically are less costly, but also less secure. And that should all make sense here in a bit. So this is a new figure that I really like that was put out by the IPCC last week. And so it gives you all of the primary CDR technologies that are under development, and it has things color coded so you can differentiate between the different methodologies. And so I'm confusing you a little bit because I'm talking about engineered versus natural, but the IPCC actually doesn't use that language. They use land-based, ocean-based, geochemical, and chemical. And then you can see the ones in front of the green background are ones that happen and are terrestrial, so they happen on land. And then all the technologies in the blue happen out in the ocean. And then you have this time scale of storage, which is really important. So just quickly walking through the main technologies or the main methods of carbon dioxide removal. You have afforestation, right? Planting trees. You have sequestering carbon in the soil. You have biochar, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, enhanced weathering, peatland and coastal wetland restoration, what's called blue carbon, ocean alkalinity enhancement, and ocean fertilization. And so biology is using a lot of these. Yeah, everyone except these two right here, basically. And you can actually incorporate some biology in these if you want to. And so this is another breakdown of the different methods from the online textbook, the CDR primer, where I went and sort of labeled them as either natural or engineered. And so the main takeaway here is every one of these involves biology in some way, except for direct air capture. I believe that's it. Biology is involved in all the others. Yeah, for the sake of time, I can't go through all of these in much detail. All right, so moving on, right? I'm mainly interested in trying to utilize biology, right? And so everyone's pretty familiar with photosynthesis, right? That is a biochemical pathway through primarily the Calvin cycle, right? Where CO2 is fixed into higher order molecules like glucose, driven by, of course, sunlight and this really amazing protein or enzyme called rubisco, right? That converts the CO2 into not just cellulose, but lots of other complex polymers that can store the carbon for a fairly long time. And then you have non-photosynthetic or autotrophic pathways that use hydrogen instead of sunlight as the driving force for the reaction. And so a lot of bacteria, not a lot, but some bacteria have this capability to fix CO2 into various higher order compounds. And the wood-Jungdahl pathway is one example of that. Okay, so this Calvin cycle, right? This happens all the time. Everyone's familiar with photosynthesis. But something I don't think most people are familiar with is this annual cycle of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so everyone's familiar with the slow increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. But if you look at it on a seasonal basis, the CO2 actually fluctuates by almost 10 ppm every year. And so you can see starting basically now in April through October, the CO2 globally will decrease. And then it will start to increase in October, November, and it'll keep increasing back to April, right? So it decreases in spring and summer, increases in fall and winter. And that's because there's so much more land in the Northern Hemisphere that during the spring and summer, it's bringing in carbon through photosynthesis. And then a lot of that carbon goes back into the atmosphere through degradation and respiration during the fall and winter. So the main point here is biology already sequesters a lot of carbon, but then it just releases it again. So if you can take advantage of all the carbon before it's released and sequester it, you could use biology to really bring down carbon in the atmosphere. And by biocarbon resources, these are some of the dominant ones that people are looking at, right? I mean, a lot of this is pretty obvious to you, right? Trees, crops, ag residues is a very sustainable option, forestry residues and industrial residues, right? A lot of this carbon just sits out in fields, isn't utilized, and then just goes up in the atmosphere. So if you could somehow take it, valorize it, convert it into some value and sequester carbon, that would be a win-win. Livestock waste, MSW, algae, bacteria, fungi, lots of different sources of carbon, fixed carbon from the atmosphere that we could try to utilize and sequester. There's this new term that a lot of folks in my field are starting to use. People call it BICRs, but it stands for biomass carbon removal and storage, right? And everyone before, like maybe 3 years ago, would always talk about bioenergy with carbon capture. But people are now realizing the energy content of biomass is actually not as high as the carbon content. And so the goal with any of these different biosystems to remove CO2 from the atmosphere is that you need to, over the life cycle, remove more than you emit. So now I'm going to walk you through a few engineered biosystems and then a few natural systems. And then I'll talk a little bit about one project I'm working on. Okay, so some of the leading engineered biosystems include things like fermentation, anaerobic digestion, pyrolysis, and gasification. And for the energy club, I think all of these you should be familiar with to a certain extent, because all of these do produce energy products, or they can produce energy products. These are large anaerobic digesters making biogas, for instance, from waste. So I'm going to start with fermentation of ethanol in particular, because the US has a huge ethanol industry. It definitely has problems, but some folks in my field are pretty convinced, I don't really know if I'm in that bucket yet, but are pretty convinced you can make this process much more sustainable. So anyways, if you look at corn ethanol production, you grow corn out in the field, right? That sucks in carbon through photosynthesis. There are new tech practices being developed for farmers to sequester the carbon in their soil and also enhance crop productivity. So that's sort of a new way to sink carbon during the growth period. But you also release CO2 and other types of greenhouse gases through fertilizer, soil degradation, irrigation, and harvest, right? So if farmers can really minimize these and then maximize these, they're going to be bringing more carbon into the system and less back into the atmosphere. But anyway, when you take the biomass and you start processing it, right, you have to transport it to a pre-processing site. Oftentimes, that's a source of CO2. At processing, you're burning energy most likely. That's another source. You have to transport it then to the fermentation facility, another source. At the fermentation site, there's actually a great opportunity to capture CO2 from the fermentation vessels because it's very concentrated and it's very cheap to capture. So I'm going to show you an example. There's companies doing this today. They capture the CO2 and they pump it deep underground into these saline reservoirs. There's some emissions here. You transport it to the fuel station, more emissions. And then of course you combust it in your car. 10% of all your gasoline is ethanol, right? That CO2 goes back in the atmosphere. You can take the sinks and the sources for all of these and you can quantify them on a normalized unit like kilogram CO2 equivalent per ton ethanol fuel. And then you can simply just look at what's removed and emitted. And again, the goal is to have the value be greater than 0. So you removed more than you've emitted. So some examples, Archer Daniel Midlands is a big bioprocessing company in the Midwest. And they have a large ethanol refinery in Decatur, Illinois, that is currently sequestering over 1 million tons of CO2 from their ethanol fermentation vessels. And so they're trying to make carbon negative biofuel through this, as well as I mentioned, some upstream soil carbon sequestration. The next one, I think you all in the Energy Club might be interested in. This is sort of a newer concept that I'm really excited about. It's basically decoupling land from bioprocessing. And so the idea is, right now there's a lot of technology advancement in what's going on in what's called direct air capture, which takes CO2 directly from the air using a chemical process. You can take the CO2 from the air as well as nitrogen and then use electric catalysis to basically chemically reduce the CO2 to C1 intermediates like carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, formic acid, methane, and you can reduce the nitrogen into ammonia and use these as this like soup of C1 and N1 intermediates as growth media for fermentation to make all sorts of different products. Anaerobic digestion. So this is like very early stage, right? This is established. I just threw this in here because I thought you all might be interested, but this is definitely more on the R&D scale. But the rest of the examples I'm going to show are pretty advanced and commercial. So anaerobic digestion, this is a very established technology. It's a big deal in our state. Our state has a lot of food waste as well as swine waste. This is a swine lagoon right here. And that pink color is actually from the types of bacteria that grow in the swine waste. But you can see through the anaerobic digestion process, you produce a lot of CO2. You can see better on this slide. So resolution is not great, but the overall chemistry is converting carbohydrates and waste into methane and CO2. You eventually separate the methane, so it can be used as a substitute for natural gas. And then the CO2 is pretty highly concentrated, so it's easy to capture and sequester. You can also do soil carbon sequestration. The next is pyrolysis. This is a thermochemical process that takes biomass, treats it at between 500 and 1000 degrees Celsius under an inert atmosphere, so no oxygen. And you get three products from this. You get what's called pyrogas, which is some CO2 as well as some low molecular weight organics that can be combusted, bio oil, and then biochar. And so bio oil traditionally has been viewed as a potential precursor for fuels. It's kind of similar to crude oil, not really, but it's a little bit similar. So you could take it, upgrade it, reform it, and make gasoline or jet fuel. Biochar is a fixed carbon material that can be used as a soil amendment. Right, and this is a very stable form of carbon. But what I'm really interested in right now is there's this concept of taking the bio oil, since it's kind of similar to crude oil, not as valuable though, and pumping it back underground. So Charm is this company that's scaling up very fast in the Midwest, and they have developed these modularized trucks that go out to a field and they harvest ag residue in a pyrolysis reactor at the field scale. They make bio oil, and then they pump the bio oil to like a centralized hub, and then that oil is just injected back into the ground where crude oil came from. So it's like reversing the process. The next is gasification for hydrogen generation. And so there's a company, Moat, who's out in California. I'm on the technical advisory board of this company, and they're also growing rapidly, not as fast as Charm, but they're very ambitious, and they're taking wood waste in the state of California and using sort of off-the-shelf technologies to gasify it, which produces syngas, and then you can take that syngas, which is carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and CO2, and do what's called a water gas shift, which converts the carbon monoxide into CO2 and makes more hydrogen. So anyway, you get a pretty concentrated stream of CO2 and hydrogen. Hydrogen can be used for all sorts of different purposes, not just vehicles. You can make fertilizer. That's like one of the main uses of hydrogen today. And then the CO2 can be sequestered underground, or they're looking at partnering with a company to make cement with CO2. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the natural approaches, right? So microbiomes, biochar, and then a little bit on robotics and analytics. So not as relevant to you all in the energy club, but maybe still interesting. So microbiomes, there's a lot of work going on right now with soil scientists and biogeochemists to try and find ways to enhance the rate of carbon sequestration in soils. There's a ton of carbon in our soils. It's typically at a balance, right? You have fixation and respiration through microorganisms, but you can do things, certain practices, certain bioinoculants that kind of change the microbiome to bring in more carbon. And so I think to define it, right, soil carbon sequestration is making changes to land management practices that increase the carbon content of soil resulting in a net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. And so one leading technology right now is trying to shift the microbiome from bacteria to fungi. If you can achieve that, fungi are much better at storing carbon than bacteria. So that's sort of the biotic pathway. That's one example of a biotic pathway. There are some abiotic options where you could take various minerals, apply them to the soil, and actually fix carbon, make carbonates with the minerals. That's an abiotic or inorganic pathway. Moving on to biochar. So I mentioned with pyrolysis, biochar is a product from pyrolysis. And so you can take that biochar and put it into the soil to sequester that carbon. So this is from a soil scientist here at NC State named Alex Woodley, Dr. Woodley. And this is a drone image of one of his field studies he's doing right now with various types of biochar, incorporating them in soils in Eastern Carolina. And so if you try to, so if you do like techniques for microbiome enhancement, right, you kind of get a plateau. The soil is only going to take up so much carbon naturally. And so that's the idea of biochar, is you kind of break through that plateau and bring in more carbon into the soil. And in our state, in Eastern Carolina, the soils are really sandy. And so this doesn't really work very well. Microbiomes, there's not a lot of microbes in the soil anyway in Eastern Carolina. It's pretty bland soil. So biochar seems to be one of the most viable pathways to put carbon into the soil. The next is looking at this field called precision agriculture, which is a really big deal in my field. I don't work in it, but people have been advancing robotics and analytics for controlling a lot of inputs to the field, like nitrogen fertilizer, water. But people are now looking at carbon management as like maybe the next frontier in precision ag. And so just one example is this is a near infrared spectrophotometer that's used in labs. And what they've been able to show is you can correlate organic carbon content with very quick measurements just using light and absorption. And so the idea is, can you modularize this into a small robot that goes out, takes a little sample of soil, quickly measures carbon content, and then with remote sensing and the Internet of Things and all that stuff, inform the farmer what their carbon content is throughout the season. So now moving into some policies, right? The US is starting to take this pretty seriously. There's this policy called the 45Q, which is managed by the IRS. It's a tax credit for corporations. If they capture and sequester CO2, they can receive $50 per ton for the tax credit. If they utilize the CO2, it's $35 per ton, so it's a little bit different. The low carbon fuel standard right now has the highest price in CO2. This is a cap and trade market, so the price fluctuates, but I think right now it's at like $150 per ton CO2. And so there are some pathways, they're very stringent. You have to meet a lot of the criteria. The main thing, and I'm not going to be going into this, but one of the biggest concerns with this whole field, just to take a pause, is that the CO2 may come back out again, right? Like you have to be like absolutely sure it's permanently sequestered. Otherwise, like this is not a good idea at all. And so the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, they're taking that really seriously. And so you have to do like extensive monitoring, which is why they, I think, provide more money. It's because it's expensive to do the monitoring. Well, it can be. And then the Renewable Fuel Standard, I was actually talking to someone at the Department of Energy today who doesn't work at the EPA, but there's a lot of interest in taking the Renewable Fuel Standard and incorporating carbon management into it. This is basically what mandates the use of ethanol. So all the ethanol in your gasoline comes from this policy. And right now, ethanol that's put in your gasoline tank is like really not clean. It's made pretty inefficiently, but it can be clean, just will cost a little bit more. Okay, so for the last like maybe 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to go through one project that I'm working on with a bunch of other institutes in the US, which is to assess opportunities across the country to remove 1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year from the atmosphere by 2050. That's kind of one of the goals. And so we're looking at 4 different pathways: forest sequestration, soil sequestration, direct air capture, and then bikers. And so I'm on the bikers team. So is Ethan. And so far, we've done some preliminary work where we've done a geospatial assessment. And so this has all the counties in the US color-coded with the amount of biomass that's available in each county. And then we also have point source emissions of landfills, wastewater treatment plants, digesters, ethanol refineries, and pulp and paper mills, because they all emit biogenic CO2. So if you look here, there's actually a lot of CO2 available from point source emissions, staggering amount, a lot from wastewater treatment plants. So if you could capture that and then somehow sequester it, whether deep underground or through mineralizing it or making materials out of it, you could bring a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere every year. So if you're going to try to sequester it underground in deep geological formations, this is where you would do it, is in the dark blue areas. So mainly the Gulf region is where most of the suitable geology is for long-term sequestration. And they're already doing this in the petroleum industry, right? They do what's called enhanced oil recovery. It's not great, but they take CO2, they compress it into a liquid, and then they inject it into oil wells to help push out more oil. And unfortunately, that expertise is necessary to scale up the carbon removal industry. So there's you have to be careful with what's called a moral hazard. So some people, very rightly so, are concerned about using this field of carbon removal as a way to extend the oil industry's operations. Because in their mind, if they can just pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere, they can also keep emitting it. But that's not at all what we're trying to do here. So this study for the biomass resources, we're looking at a lot of different things within agriculture, forestry, and municipal solid waste. And again, we're looking at biogenic point source CO2 emissions. A lot of biocarbon that we're hoping to sequester, or at least look at the potential. And so this is sort of a simplified breakdown of the different biocarbon sources. And then we're looking at about 7 different conversion technologies. I already went through most of these: gasification, pyrolysis, combustion is pretty straightforward. Liquefaction, I didn't have time to go through. Fermentation, anaerobic digestion, and then simple mechanical treatment to make materials. These are some of the products you get out from these different conversion pathways. And then these are the sinks, right? Importantly, the ways the carbon will be sequestered. So this is geological sequestration of the CO2. You can inject bio oil, you can sequester biochar, and then long-lived products, including wood products, bioplastics. All that carbon stays locked away for a long time. So we're using what's called the built optimization model. This was developed by folks at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It was originally designed as an optimization tool for biofuel production. Recently adapted for bioenergy, basically biocombustion with carbon capture. And so we're looking to adapt and modify this model for bikers. So built 2.0 will be the biocarbon infrastructure, logistics, and transportation, taking the emphasis off of the energy and fuel and more so on the carbon. And so just real quickly, some of the considerations that this model takes into account, and then some actions in italics, showing the actions that my team is, not my team, but the team I'm on is going to take to adopt this optimization model for our use. So currently it takes into account spatial distribution of biocarbon sources, right? On a county by county basis, it knows how much different biocarbon is available, but it doesn't take into account industrial emissions. So that's something we have to bring into the model. It can cite, size, and then estimate the capital and operating costs of biorefineries at every county to convert the biocarbon into some product that sequesters the carbon. It takes into account market dynamics. Well, it needs to, at least. It doesn't do a very good job of that right now. It has intermodal transportation system. So yes, it knows how much biocarbons in every single county throughout the US. It can size and cite the biorefinery, but it can also bring costs for transporting the biocarbon to the refinery, and then also the CO2 or the product to its end use, or sink, right? Gate to sink transportation logistics have to be included. And then, yeah, the siting and sizing of the biocarbon sinks it can also do. So the full life cycle. So this is just an example of an output that we don't have data yet for our study, but this is something we're hoping to generate for a specific region and a specific biocarbon feedstock. You can basically calculate, the max percentage of biocarbon removal for that county, for instance, and for a particular feedstock. And then this will tell you the number of the different types of biorefineries, technology 1, 2, 3, 4, that are needed to remove your desired level of biocarbon for that region at the lowest cost. So yeah, there's a lot of moving parts, and honestly, it's still a bit confusing to me, but I'm learning. All right, so to sort of end this lecture, just going to go through a list of some of the projects I'm working on. So the first one I just give you a brief overview of, which is sort of like a national level assessment for large scale carbon removal across the US. I'm working on a project that's looking at integrating carbon capture utilization into chemical pulp mills. A new project of mine is looking at rock quarry finds. There's a big rock quarry just north of Durham that is full of basalts, which are basically originating from volcanoes, and turns out they can sequester carbon pretty well. We're looking at fermentation of pulp mill waste to ethanol, and at some point we'll be assessing the viability of carbon capture in that process. I have a couple small projects on what we're calling electrifying animal feed. So that's that electric catalysis of the CO2 into C1 intermediates and then doing fermentation of that. Formic acid is the C1 intermediate that we're interested in. Butanol and nanocellulose from CRISPR edited poplar. So there's you're in CNR, right? I think is what you said. Dr. Jack Wang is a professor. He edits mainly poplars, but other tree species using CRISPR. So he's edited a certain variety that is amenable to fermentation. Enzyme enhanced anaerobic digestion of food waste. And then we're looking at a final project of mine is looking at taking what's called biocrude, which is a byproduct from pyrolysis, and making graphite anode material. These are some of our sponsors for the research we do, and that is it. So thanks for your time, and happy to take questions.
I'm actually from Central Illinois. I've been to ADM.
Oh, cool.
So I thought you mentioned that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Anyone have questions here? Otherwise.
So you listed quite a few different pathways.
Yeah.
But like, if we needed to get, I mean, we do need to capture carbon, but if we needed to get like scale up as fast as possible right now, what is like one or two of the most promising pathways?
Right, that's a good question. Thank you. Let's go back to the pathways. There we go. All right, so these are kind of some of the main pathways. Certainly in the near term, most experts believe fermentation is the lowest hanging fruit because it's already a huge industry in the US. It just is currently emitting this like pure stream of CO2 that's biogenic. So the only issue with that is all the ethanol is made here. So it's not sitting on the right type of geology. But folks like Dan Sanchez at UC Berkeley, they've done a modeling to figure out how much it would cost to pipeline it. And it's not too outrageous. But I would say fermentations. You asked for nearest term, right? Yeah. Oh, there's stuff in the chat. Oh, that was you. Okay.
If anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the chat on Zoom. Anyone else have a question here?
So you mentioned that you can fertilize the oceans.
Yeah.
With, I guess, nutrients, and then you would have what, algae grow and bloom, and then the dead algae would sink to the bottom and not be decomposed.
That's the idea.
Is there an issue with like bloom occurring because of that, or would this be in a controlled environment?
No, definitely not controlled. So this is one that receives a lot of criticism. Iron fertilization, the concept's been around for decades, but a lot of phytoplankton, their limiting nutrient is iron. And so if you just spike the ocean surface water with iron, you'll get a massive bloom. But you're absolutely right. The biggest concern is how, if you start growing toxic algae, that would not be great. And what does it do on the ecosystem? That's a big concern. The other concern is just how permanent is the carbon, right? Is it really going to sink? If it comes down into marine sediment, which is the idea, that's at least 100 years of good storage. And that's kind of the agreed upon minimum length of time for all these carbon storage technologies. Like as electrification takes off, that's going to take 50 years. Really the next 100 years are the most important to store carbon. So if some of the carbon ends up coming back out in like 300 years from now, that won't be as big of a deal because hopefully we decarbonize our entire economy. And the CO2 concentrations have fallen quite a bit. But anyway, so to answer your question, yes, it's a major concern. There are major concerns within this pathway.
You said that nitrous oxide was also a big greenhouse gas concern. Is there any other research for capturing that as well?
Yeah, good question. Nitrous oxide, yeah. 300 times as potent as CO2. Not well capturing it. I think it's avoiding the emissions is kind of that's the main thing with that. So nitrous oxide is so dilute in the atmosphere, you can't capture it effectively at all. But Alex Woodley, the professor that I had referenced doing the soil carbon with biochar, that's his like big passion is reducing nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture. I don't really know what he does, to be honest, to do it, but I would look up his research if you're curious to learn more.
Are there incentives for people to adopt practices?
Yeah, there are. That's a good question. So, interestingly, the incentives are not really from the government. Right now, those policies I put up before don't involve, so carbon sequestration in soils is not eligible. But these new markets that are being developed by apparently huge tech companies, they will accept soil carbon. And so right now there's kind of like a race to establish companies to manage and certify the carbon storage. So there's a company called Carbon Direct, which some of my colleagues work at, and that's what they do is like they basically go to like Google, and Google tells them, I want to buy $2 million worth of carbon credits to offset some of my like really hard emissions. And then they go out and they find the people to do it, and they make sure it's like legit. And it's not like, there's a lot of, the last 20 years, there's been a lot of like really faulty carbon credits that aren't real at all. It's just like we planted a tree and it burned the next year and like no one ever knew. So yeah, the management and monitoring is becoming a much bigger deal in these private voluntary markets.
So I work with anaerobic digestion and I've optimized biogas production.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's fun, but the technology is there. A lot of it is like policy that is not letting it be fully adapted, or trying to away from adapting it. So I was wondering if there's other policy challenges that the technology is facing that's slowing the adaptation of it, or if it's more of a research and development that we're still working on.
Yeah, so anaerobic digestion, the LCFS, you familiar with that? You probably, right? Yeah. That's the most robust, well, actually, and the RFS. Sorry, I don't know where I put policies. That was up here. Yeah, both of these two are helping out renewable natural gas, but biogas. But yeah, it's a bit expensive, right? Especially the biggest issue is natural gas is so cheap. And so either you need to increase the incentives for biogas or put some sort of tax or something on fossil carbon to make natural gas more expensive. But it's not really a technology issue, it's a cost issue. The only technology issue I bring up with anaerobic digestion is currently it mainly uses food waste and animal waste. If you can innovate this process to use lignocellulosic materials, which today the processes aren't good at converting them into biogas, but if you can, then that unlocks, I mean, that will increase the potential by, I don't know, at least 10x. So that's, I guess, a technical limitation. Looks like, okay, yeah. Are there any countries outside the US that are doing scaled up bio CCS projects? That's a good question. Yeah, there are, but most of the examples I know of are not biological though. I don't know, Ethan, Julia.
Yeah, my mind just goes to like direct air capture.
Yeah, there's a lot of direct air capture happening in European countries, Scandinavian countries in particular. The US is leading for sure the biomass removal. That's because we have a huge bioeconomy, right? Much larger than most European countries. So yeah, I'm a little stumped. I know there's a couple companies that are looking at utilizing CO2, biogenic CO2 as well. So sorry, I can't really answer that question.
So, as the climate, like the average temperatures increase and like there's less fertile land for like farming and stuff, is it going to be more difficult to like use some of these processes because we have like limited space to actually use it?
Yeah, great question. Definitely could be. Yeah, so that's part of the reason why I'm pretty fascinated with this concept, because it doesn't require land use. But yeah, a lot of these, like this geospatial plot of all the biomass resources, right? That's assuming that we don't have massive droughts and there isn't like huge food insecurity. That would definitely change the dynamics. But yeah, some of the existing point source emissions from pulp and paper, ethanol, wastewater, those will probably still be available for a long time. But, and then one other thing is a lot of the biomass, the biocarbon resources we're interested in using, sorry, right? If you look at all of these, none of these are land intensive or resource intensive, right? We're looking at a lot of residues, tons of residues. So it's not like we're trying to go out and take fertile soil and then grow crops just to remove carbon. But it's a good question. I think there was something else in the chat. I'm curious of the potential of CDR via biosystem. Is there a rough estimation on how much biosystem CDR could contribute to the total negative emissions requirement we had? Oh yeah, we had to achieve 2-degree target. Also, the sequestration potential, can we store as much carbon as we want? Again, two awesome questions. So the first one, all the way back up here. Here we go. Okay, so if you look to the IPCC, and this is kind of like experts now think we're not going to need as much negative emissions as shown here, but if we did, right, in 2060, we'll need 10 gigatons of removal per year. Most people think biomass can contribute realistically 1 to 2, maybe 3 total per year. 1 to 3 gigatons of CO2 removal per year from biosystems. The rest has to come from direct air capture and other methods. So, and then the other question was about, is there enough room for storage? And the answer is yes. There's enough. This was a big question I had up until recently, but I've been pretty much convinced now. There's enough geological storage to store way more CO2 than we need to store. And the US of all countries has probably the most storage per country. And a lot of it's in here and up in here. And, well, you can see where. So.
I guess for that storage, well, first, I'm a civil.
Okay.
So what is the storage is what's gonna happen with the way the soil behaves. And it's gonna be like, and those has since the start of the project. So if we're gonna act that decades. I mean, what is the effect in our infrastructure?
Mhm.
And if that's taken into account in the research.
I'm not a geologist. I just met a really neat geologist who's at West Virginia University. He's looking at this really closely. But I think what gives me a little comfort, it's sort of a sad form of comfort, but the oil industry's been doing this for like 50, 60 years. In this region, pumping just massive quantities of CO2 deep underground. So they have a pretty good idea, at least with this. But in other areas where the geology differs, absolutely, there are concerns about like pumping into a fault line by accident, and then the CO2 escapes very rapidly through the fault line, creating a new fault line, an earthquake. And so most people in this field, sort of the doomsday scenario is we have a huge project and there's like a massive leak of CO2 that causes some sort of environmental or human disaster, like a nuclear. It wouldn't be on the same scale as a nuclear disaster, but that could really hurt the industry, right? It doesn't take much for people to be like, okay, we're not doing that again. So big concern. Any questions? Yeah.
So would finding like smaller pockets to store it, would that be more advantageous then? Because then you wouldn't have to worry about massive leaks or
Um,
is that the kind of thing?
I don't know.